I'm really happy to be here. I did this talk last year and it generated some really great discussion around managing fatigue, and not even just managing it, but understanding it, normalizing it, validating it, and then more particularly in the context of everyday life. So as an occupational therapist, of course, that's my cheerleading role, is that everything is relevant in the context of everyday life. So having said that, we will get started. And before I do, I just wanted to say a thank you to Omega Medical Associates, in particular, Sandra D'Souza, who's the executive director there. She often encourages us, champions us to put on and think about ways to connect with the community. And so this is one of those ways. And as background too, not only am I an OT, I'm PhD trained. And so my PhD was in neurophysiology of concussion. And so that's my background and how I approach this particular talk. So what you can expect from today is a definition of fatigue, to understand the context of fatigue from a person perspective, occupation perspective, and environmental factors perspective. Reflect on the good old days bias to reframe and normalize fatigue. Consider the role of the healthcare provider in fatigue management. And I saw that there was a registered nurse in the audience, so that's wonderful. Gain a high level of understanding in evidence-based fatigue management interventions. So what's out there and how effective is it at mitigating fatigue? And understand that not all fatigue is created equally. Yes, it's one word, but it is such a complex construct, often overlapped with many other comorbidities and issues. And we will unpack that today. And by the end, I hope that you walk away with some general principles of fatigue self-management based on the years of experience of your survivorship and that some of you have disclosed. I'm sure some of these tools are already in your toolbox, but if this presentation can prompt you to think about that in a different way, then that's what I hope you walk away with. So before we get started, I always like asking this type of question before, because it really sets the stage to some of the topics and concepts that I'll talk about. Is reflect on your baseline right now, where 0 could mean that you have absolutely no fatigue, you have perfect energy, you can fly through the sky. 5, maybe you're somewhat fatigued and still functional. And 10 is you're sleepy, drowsy, enough that you could take a rest break or go to sleep. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to put in the chat if you don't mind sharing your level of fatigue right now from 0 to 10 based on those parameters. I'll self-disclose that before this presentation, I was probably at a solid 6. Because I'm excited, I'm now back down to a 3. 8 or 9, 10. Okay. That is a really high level of fatigue. So I hope to keep you engaged enough for you to take away from this presentation. Thank you for sharing. So what is atypical fatigue? Atypical fatigue is really around the numbers that some of you have just posted. And I know one of you self-disclosed having chronic fatigue syndrome. And so atypical fatigue is the sense of sleepiness or tiredness that you wouldn't expect for your stage of life, for this time of day. And so it's something that can be really quite debilitating on someone's life when they're functioning at, an 8 or 9 or 10 at any given time during the day, especially when they're not ready for bed and have other things to do. Atypical fatigue, a lot of the theories suggest that it is kind of comes from the central nervous system. So everything that happens in our bodies and our minds with our movements and our thoughts, of course, is regulated by our central nervous system. And this too regulates fatigue. And more specifically is the autonomic nervous system. And a lot of the evidence and scientific base has suggested that there is this breakdown, this dysregulation between 2 really important systems. One being the parasympathetic system, your rest and relax and digest, and your sympathetic system, which is your fight, flight, and freeze response. And so because of this dysregulation, the system is kind of in overdrive, if you will, causing more fatigue than what would be expected. So in very simple terms, this disruption leads to rapid fatigability. So just poor stamina to complete daily living tasks or even simple mental tasks. This means oftentimes with atypical fatigue that you have a really low threshold for physical and mental activity. And what I mean by that is maybe you could only do, this much now compared to this much before you need a break, before you feel really exhausted. And it is very subjective. Someone's 10 might look different from someone else's 10, might look different from someone else's 8 or 5 or 6. But generally speaking, atypical fatigue is really characterized by decreased energy levels and overall the need for more rest. So I opened up the presentation by talking about the fact that fatigue is a really complex symptom, term, clinical construct, because there are so many different things that play a role in how someone can be really fatigued in an atypical way. And so I'm drawing on one of the OT models, which is the person, occupation, and environment model, which basically says that all of these three circles interact in a really unique way to influence our daily life functioning. So if we break this down a little bit further, each of us comes with our own unique profiles. Perhaps we have pre-existing histories prior to our ABIs, vulnerabilities in terms of our age, our social history, other comorbid diagnoses, our perceptions, our own internal perceptions of disability, and of course, other physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms. But that's not all. So that's the point that I want to make today, is that it's not just the person with fatigue, but it's also the types of activities that cause it. What someone needs to do, wants to do, and is expected to do, whether that be parenting responsibilities, work responsibilities, housekeeping, daily routines, things that you used to enjoy, social and recreational pursuits. And then here's the other piece too. Fatigue is also driven by things that are outside of our control, the environment itself. Our rehab teams influence us, legal contexts, the type of family support that we have, our community settings, and our work environments. So all of these three things, and you could see all the different factors that come together here, influence our daily functioning when it comes to fatigue. So let's unpack this a little bit more with respect to the person. Fatigue is non-specific, so it's not unique to ABI, and in fact, not unique to the general population at large. Even those that are otherwise healthy, that have not sustained any brain injuries, go on to experience fatigue throughout their typical day. In the realm of clinical context, of course, we can see that fatigue exists across other types of issues, whether that be mental health issues, depression, anxiety, other pain or somatic symptom disorders, can exist with orthopedic injuries and other chronic health conditions. So what does fatigue look like? Fatigue is really complex because it both causes these issues in physical, cognitive, and emotional domains, and it's also the result of these issues. So we see it at both of the tail ends here. Physically, someone with really atypical fatigue will have poor stamina. Perhaps they're so exhausted that fatigue causes headaches. They might report flu-like symptoms like my body is aching. I feel kind of like a general malaise, disturbed sleep, sensory sensitivity. They're so exhausted that they can't process the environment around them. And also gastrointestinal issues. I opened up by saying that atypical fatigue is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. And so a lot of that being stuck in fight or flight means that for some, this results in bloating, discomfort. Cognitively, I'm sure many of you are aware of this too, that mental fog and cloudiness, kind of like you can't see your way through enough to think clearly. Reduced memory, challenges with new learning, and just a struggle to goal set. Finding an idea in your mind that you want to do, that you're really motivated to
You're
do.
talking too fast.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will.
Sorry, did you hear me? Oh my goodness, sorry.
It's okay. Was that for me that I was talking too fast?
Yes, sorry. I was mumbling. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you to hear that. I'm writing at the same time while you're speaking and I'm trying to process it all. My apologies. Let me repeat. Let me take that back and say, excuse me, could you kindly speak slower, please,
Yes,
if you don't
yes,
mind.
thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
No problem at all. And yes, if there's any feedback while I'm going through this, please let me know. So I'll recap then some of the things that I just said, just to consolidate it. Fatigue
Just
causes,
perhaps, is there going to, will we have access to your slides
yes, I will provide
after?
them.
Oh, that would be great. That's it.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
And it'll also be available on YouTube. So uh, there's that as well. But please continue, Melissa. Thank you.
No worries. So just to recap, the kind of the main point of this slide is that fatigue both causes manifestations in physical, cognitive, and emotional domains, but it's also the result of them. And I don't think I got to the emotional piece yet, but for people with really atypical fatigue, of course, we see that they're quite sluggish. They're dragging their feet throughout the day. It's really hard to self-activate, bring themselves to have a normal amount of energy to carry out things that they would be expected to do. So as a result, we might see mood swings, agitation, withdrawal, and low frustration tolerance. And so if we kind of break this down further, this is often what I hear. And I'll tell you that my background, particularly as an OT, is I do catastrophic impairment determination assessments. So I see people with traumatic brain injuries from mild all the way to severe. And these are some of the quotes that I hear. So from a physical perspective, my whole body hurts. I can't do this. There's too much going on right now. Cognitively, I feel like I'm doing this so slowly, I can't think straight. What did you say? I'm having a really hard time processing everything right now. I can't even think about the weekend right now. Emotionally, I'm exhausted. I just want to be left alone. I'm getting so annoyed right now. I don't have the energy to talk on the phone right now. So you can see all the ways that fatigue diffuses in all of these aspects of our life. So I wanted to infuse just one little bit of humor for those of you who are fans of The Office. And here he says, I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them. And so there's been a well-established concept, a psychological misperception that has been established in the mild traumatic brain injury population that basically says that people living with brain injury often underestimate past problems. So before they were injured, so I'll rephrase that. After the brain injury, they often think that they had kind of perfect levels of energy, never experienced fatigue before, and were in a really, really solid, high functioning state. And that may be true, but this common misperception here is saying that that's a bit inflated after a brain injury. And again, this applies to mild traumatic brain injury. Simply put, those with brain injury report their pre-injury functioning as better than the average person. And when that happens, it can really negatively impact how they do in their life, their ability to return to work, because they have kind of a skewed perception of how perfect their life was before the accident and really trying to go back to reattaining that, baseline pre-injury status. So back to this complex interaction between the person, the activity or occupation, and the environment. And highlighting here that the environment includes your rehab teams, your healthcare providers, of course, your support systems, your networks, work environment, and perhaps for some of us, a legal context as well. So if there's one slide I really want you to take away from this presentation, it's this one. And that is that fatigue can become a negative feedback loop. So I want to hone in on the idea of disability perception. And this is the fact that initially after the injury, so for some of you, this may not apply anymore because you've been a survivor for many years. This idea that I can't do it. You're so worried about the fatigue that you have that you just say, I can't do it. So then you don't do it. And it's this loop. I can't, so I won't. But over time, when we get ourselves in that disability perception loop, we actually go through something called functional deconditioning, where over time you haven't done something, so you haven't done it, and now you can't tolerate it. So it's kind of the principle of use it or lose it. And so when you really avoid, environments for a really long amount of time, when you're avoiding daily activity, when it's really tough for you to get back to doing a certain task, it inevitably will get really hard to get back to it over time. Oftentimes, this leads to poor functioning and a very empty daily routine. So for the healthcare providers in the audience, there's a really strong rehabilitation opportunity here to break the cycle, to break that perception that some things are possible. Perhaps it's not a return to the baseline that once was, but certainly a way to rebuild those energy reserves in a way that's meaningful for that particular person. And so having said that, one of the most important messages to convey to an ABI survivor, both in the acute and chronic phases of their recovery, is that fatigue is very normal, it is expected, and it might be lifelong. And so fatigue is a normal and expected aspect of activity engagement. You can expect that when you engage in things, of course, your energy will be depleted, just as it would be on a typical day before going to bed. Fatigue, while very uncomfortable and some even more uncomfortable compared to others, is a necessary experience to recondition the brain and body, going back to the use it or lose it principle, that we have to find ways to be uncomfortable for a bit of time to kind of push past any barriers that we have to rebuild any energy reserves. The understanding that, of course, and many of you will know this, some activities cause more fatigue than others. And that being rigid about fatigue avoidance will likely cause more fatigue. I see this particularly in the mild TBI population, where over time, people get really, really scared about symptom escalation. If I do this, then my day will be ruined, then I can't, then tomorrow will be off. And so it's this huge cascade effect of avoidance of symptoms. But it means maybe that they're missing out on things that they would really derive joy from, and that might even fill up their energy cup. And so being rigid about avoidance oftentimes leads to more fatigue. And so the goal is to strike a comfortable balance, not pushing yourself to torture and trying to do, a full bout of activity at a 10 out of 10, but certainly to strike a balance between rest and activity. Finding small, meaningful ways to expand what you do on a given day and gradually returning to a desired baseline state. And I say baseline here as new baselines, not the ones that you had at the time of your brain injury or before, but the ones that you have reestablished now as meaningful to you. So the role of the healthcare provider. And I think I only saw one in the audience, the nurse. And so this is geared to you, but it's great for the others to have this in mind as well with respect to what they can expect and understand of their healthcare providers, whether that be an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist, a kinesiologist, a nurse, a social worker, the list goes on and on. But here's some of the questions that healthcare providers should reflect on when intervening with ABI survivors that struggle with fatigue are, am I providing education on both rest and activity to manage fatigue symptoms. So I'm not just providing information that says, don't do things that bug you, but I'm also saying, find things that energize you. Have I advised against engaging in certain activities? Sometimes, as a catastrophic impairment assessor, I often ask clients why they're not doing things anymore. And one of the things that they've said is, my so-and-so said I shouldn't anymore, or my doctor says I shouldn't do this anymore. And so as healthcare providers, we really need to reflect on why we're telling individuals not to do things anymore, especially when there are no medical contraindications. There's no risk to our personal safety or health if we do those particular activities. Do my recommendations align with the larger team's rehab goals? Am I an outlier in asking this person to try and do different activities? Or am I well matched with the rest of the team in encouraging that balance between rest and activity? Are my recommendations realistic in the context of the client's rehab treatment schedule? Now, I know that I saw in the chat, there were a couple of you that have been ABI survivors for a number of years, so this might not apply to you. But for those with very acute injuries, oftentimes they are bombarded by rehabilitation support, hours and hours of rehab, which in and of itself is quite exhausting. So much so that these individuals don't have time for themselves to even try to do things that they used to do because they are engaged in so much rehab. And so as healthcare providers, we really have to be conscious about what we're asking people to do and allowing them to live their life or get back to living their life in a way that's meaningful to them. And the final point is, am I introducing a return to life early on in the rehab journey? So that's exactly what I said here, that in addition to, brain games and exercises and therapy sessions, am I simply providing recommendations on getting back to their repertoire in ways that they can tolerate? Okay, again, going back to the slide, that person, environment, and activity, all of these things interact, these domains interact to influence how you function on a day-to-day basis and your level of activity tolerance. So let's talk about activities and what we can do about those. So for the next few slides, I'm going to go over some of the general fatigue management strategies, and then that will lead nicely into one of the pieces of literature that I want to go over with you that kind of highlights the effectiveness of some of these strategies. So energy conservation, the 4 Ps. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this. Planning, what does that look like? This looks like creating a to-do list where maybe you list off the things that you need to do and you alternate between hard and easy. For me, that might mean reading a report, and when I need to take a break, I'll do something physical. Maybe I'll transfer a load of laundry. Maybe I'll take out some of the food I need to prepare for dinner. And so I'll alternate so that I don't completely deplete my energy reserves. Pacing, timed breaks to avoid symptom exacerbation. We don't want to push ourselves again to that 10 out of 10 before we take a break, because it'll be that much harder to kick back on and to get involved again in our energy reserves. So this might look like load splitting tasks over time. For those of us that are particularly fatigued by housekeeping tasks, for instance, instead of doing them all on the weekend, maybe we split those up across Monday to Friday in ways that are manageable. Prioritizing. This means that the most important activities occur when you have the best energy. For some of us, that means the morning. For others, it means, the early afternoon, and then others, it means the night. If you're night owls out there, and this is when you have the best energy in your body. Positioning, optimizing your energy with proper ergonomics and body positioning. For those of us in the audience that are working or enjoy computer use or browsing or things like that, optimizing your positioning will mean that your body doesn't have to work as hard and you maintain your energy reserves over time. I know this is a really heavy slide. I don't need to get into the details of it, but this is yet another fatigue management strategy, which has been deemed quite effective in the literature. This is cognitive behavioral therapy. Some of you have been exposed to this, I'm sure. And basically, the aim of CBT is to break the cycle between thoughts, which create feelings, which create behaviors. And those thoughts and feelings behavior, that loop is reinforced. And it's very similar to what I showed you on that slide that I told you to remember about disability perceptions and breaking that loop that I can't do it, so I won't do it, and now I can't tolerate it. And so CBT aims to break that negative feedback loop. And it does this through a number of ways. It does this through encouraging self-awareness and allowing someone to recognize the impact of those thoughts on their actions. It does this through cognitive restructuring. So reframing those negative or irrational thoughts about perhaps not being able to do things. Other behavioral techniques like exposure therapy and relaxation and goal setting, creating goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Okay, I really like this slide because it gives you an idea of how you can infuse building up your energy reserves throughout everyday life. And this doesn't just mean going to a gym. And so with low intensity exercise, you can imagine this is when you can talk and sing without panting. So you're not working that hard, but you are maintaining, a good steady pace. And what does that look like? It might look like a casual walk, bike riding, everyday movements, like walking upstairs to unload your laundry on your bed while you fold it. Or like I said, observing your freezer or fridge with in terms of what you're going to make for dinner. Moderate intensity. Here you can comfortably talk, but you can't sing. So you can imagine this takes more energy and more effort and more physical stamina and endurance. This could mean jogging or uphill walking, perhaps more advanced strenuous yoga, swimming, things that really elevate your heart rate more than a load of laundry would do to you. High intensity is really now almost in the zone of athletic training. You can't say more than a few words without gasping. And so this might mean, boot camp circuit training, could be sprints, or high impact interval training or running. So here you are really giving it your all. Your heart rate is quite elevated, and you are using a lot of energy to engage in high intensity exercise. And I wanted to put this here because as I will outline in the literature, exercise happens to be one of the most effective things that you could recommend to manage fatigue. And of course, we can't think about fatigue without thinking about sleep hygiene. A busy slide indeed, and I apologize for that, but I wanted you to have the information. And like we said, you have access to this presentation, so I'm going to go through each of these ones now. A consistent sleep schedule. This means that you're going to bed and waking up at the same time every single day. Oftentimes with fatigue, daily structure kind of becomes dismantled. It's hard to have, the regimented this, then this, then this, A, B, C. And so that makes fatigue even more challenging to manage because everything is spontaneous and no longer has that structure to it. So adding structure is a good thing. A relaxing bedtime routine. For some of us, that might mean reading, maybe taking a warm bath, doing things that are relaxing instead of stimulating, like scrolling your phone or watching TV. Optimizing your sleep environment to be dark, quiet, and cool. You are limiting your screen exposure at least 1 hour before bedtime. Again, thinking about all the relaxing things that you could be doing instead. Limiting your naps. If you need to nap during the day, you are doing your best to keep it short so you could preserve your restorative sleep at night. And then seeking natural sunlight during the day. This is a great one. I know it's been hard the last few days for sure. It's been really gloomy and gray, But as soon as I see a little bit of sunshine peeking out, I'm dashing out the door. So getting exposure to natural light during the day really helps to regulate your sleep-wake cycle. And then finally, when you can't sleep at night, one of the worst things you could do is stare at that clock. And so one of the recommendations is do not look at the time. Turn it away from your view, and do your absolute best to try and go back to the other techniques like relaxation, and keeping your bedroom, quiet and dark and cool. So as an OT, some of the things, and not just as an OT, but every healthcare provider, one of the things that is always on our mind is what can we do and how effective is it at helping? And so in the realm of research, the highest level of evidence that you can get when asking those types of questions is in the form of a meta-analysis or systematic review. And this means that everyone that has talked about a particular topic is now aggregated and included in that one paper to say, what do all of these studies show in answering this particular question? Now, in the realm of rehabilitation, specifically occupational therapy, physiotherapy, there's not a lot out there that talks about what is effective for fatigue management. And so I look to some of the neighboring populations. And so this particular paper talked about fatigue self-management by an OT or PT for chronic conditions. Now, ABI was included in that, but it was not the central aspect. And this was done by Kim and colleagues in 2022, and they are based out of McMaster, so very local. The purpose of their study was to investigate the effectiveness of OT or PT-guided fatigue self-management strategies for individuals with chronic conditions, and specifically self-management interventions. Okay, so things that you can do on your own. There was 38 studies included, and a lot of the interventions they used are those that I just went over with you in terms of those management strategies. So they looked at the effectiveness of exercise, energy conservation, activity pacing, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other multimodal programs that included a mix of those things. So not just one, but a few. So again, an overwhelming slide, but I just want to direct your attention to the leftmost column. You will see that most of the studies out there for fatigue self-management, an N of 12 studies focused on exercise. So that is what is out there in terms of the most popular intervention is exercise. Second most popular is energy conservation, those 4 Ps. The multimodal program came in third here, where it was things like exercise and a combination of the cognitive behavioral therapy. And so if you look now to the rightmost column, you'll see what some of those studies found. So in exercise, 11 out of 12 studies showed statistically or clinically significant improvements in your fatigue symptoms, your quality of life, and your sleep quality. So exercise actually showed a real difference there. With just energy conservation alone, there was no significant improvement in fatigue. So this doesn't mean that's not necessarily a bad finding. It might mean that there was no change at all. So fatigue might have not gotten worse, but maybe it didn't improve. Multimodal programs. There was no additive benefit of physical exercise in addition to CBT compared to just CBT alone. But when you combine CBT and graded activity training, so slowly progressing what you offer someone and what you're expecting them to do as they build tolerance, this resulted in better, improved fatigue and reduced emotional distress. So again, going back to this issue that fatigue is not a standalone, it often interacts alongside other physical, cognitive, and emotional symptoms. Less popular in terms of what is being offered out there in the realm of fatigue self-management is activity pacing, cognitive behavioral therapy alone, and comprehensive fatigue management. And again, this last one, it's not that it's not popular in this way, is that it's probably being offered in different ways. So it's really hard to capture that in a research setting in terms of all the different combinations and permutations that people talk about fatigue management, similar to what I've done today and all those different techniques and management strategies. But you'll see here on the rightmost column where we talk about results, that cognitive behavioral therapy, you see improved fatigue severity and the perception of illness severity. So again, thinking about that negative feedback loop, CBT really helps change the perception of our fatigue severity and fatigue disability. And that comprehensive fatigue management also helps in both of those things and building confidence in managing fatigue on our own. So if we can take all the jargon of the two previous slides and break it down to something that's a bit more tangible and manageable, the majority of interventions are activity, exercise-based. And despite the variability in the frequency and duration, so all the studies offered, different how many times you should be exercising, and for how long you should be exercising. But the one thing remained consistent is that low to moderate intensity exercise. So the doing things without extreme panting, like a brisk walk or doing loads of laundry, reduces fatigue, improves quality of life, and lends to better sleep. And so this shows us that just living your everyday life, nothing special, doing activities that everyone has access to, improves fatigue and improves quality of life. Passive, more compensatory interventions, so teaching things around energy conservation, taking breaks, pacing yourself, and load splitting, prioritizing, all of those aspects that I talked about earlier did not show significant differences in reducing fatigue. It might help you manage it and keep it at bay, but it doesn't improve, or so this research shows. But again, that number is so small. So this is not conclusive. These are just the take home. So I just want to put that out there. This is never conclusive or prescriptive, but this is what some of the research has shown to date. And finally, that CBT results in significant improvements in fatigue and illness perception. And so the take home here for everyone is that regular forms of activity and behavior change should be considered in fatigue intervention. So I wanted to round out the presentation by talking about the fact that not all fatigue is created equally. Just as we saw fatigue diffuse in physical, cognitive, and emotional domains, it also manifests differently for different people for different activities. And so here I just provided an example. You'll see a battery where perhaps someone is fully charged by being physically active, that they are able to fill up their energy cup, if you will, by going for a walk, bike riding, or swimming. For others, that might be completely depleting, that using their bodies physically is really quite draining. And so for them, maybe other spiritual endeavors might be more effective. Maybe it's meditation. Maybe it's listening to prayer, or reading other spiritual passages or religious passages. For others, it might be being social. That might act to fill up their energy cup, calling a friend, going to a restaurant, or going to an event. And for others still, it might include cognitive activities like puzzles or reading or learning a new recipe. And so the point that I wanted to make here is when one bucket is down, when you are fatigued from one aspect of your day, consider a different bucket of activity before considering inactivity. Remember that our goal is not only to mitigate fatigue, so prevent it from getting really, really awful, but it's also at the same time really important to rebuild our energy reserves. And we do that by being active. And sometimes, like I mentioned, that feels uncomfortable, but is sometimes necessary to getting back some of that energy that we're looking for. And so this saying really reigns true because it takes energy to make energy. And that might be why some of the other studies around those more passive compensatory strategies aren't as effective as those exercise kind of remediation strategies that we talked about. So for many of you, I am certain that you're well versed in some of the healthcare professionals that you would consult to get different types of help in this domain, but I wanted to put them here for you. If you are looking for exercise programs, reconditioning the body, getting up your stamina and strength, of course, physiotherapists, kinesiologists, and rehab support workers are really important here. If you're looking for self-management and coping, rebuilding, restructuring your daily routines, or maybe getting back to work, you might want to consult an OT or a neuropsychologist. You might want to consult a rehabilitation support worker. If you're looking for that extra boost of assistance, let's say in the community where you are actually trying to execute some of these things to rebuild, you have a goal of being able to, do a full bout of grocery shopping at Costco and you need that extra help, an RSW would be a great person to be there for you in that domain. Social workers, psychotherapists, OTs, neuropsychologists, and please don't get mad at me, nurse in the audience, but nurses here too, and you're not listed, would be very important members of the healthcare team to understand fatigue triggers and energizers, as well as conduct CBT. And of course, we can't forget that outside of all of this, we have to remember that the lens of this presentation wasn't meant to be the be all end all. It's just one piece to the puzzle. And these are all rehabilitation techniques. But sometimes if all of these fail, there might be something underlying that needs to be addressed by a physician. Perhaps this means a referral for a sleep study, communication with other specialists regarding medication. When I presented this talk recently, actually at the Obaya conference, there was a physiatrist in the audience, and he said, a lot of patients come to me and they're looking for a stimulant, and that changes their life completely. And so please consult with your physicians to guide some of these things if the rehab efforts are just not helping, they're just not working. So we're coming towards the end, and I hope that you've seen some and you've come to appreciate the complexity of fatigue, that you're not alone, that it is non-specific, and that it doesn't just exist within inside you, but it's also the responsibility and accountability of those around you. As a healthcare provider, it's our responsibility to notice all the factors that come into play here. Thirdly, of course, I hope that you've reflected on the good old days bias to reframe and normalize fatigue, that you understand a bit more now on the different roles that healthcare providers play in fatigue management, some of the evidence base around it and how you can put that into your own life, an understanding that not all fatigue is created equal, and that you can consider or should consider different buckets of activities to keep your day going and structured, and some general principles of fatigue management. So my take-home message, of course, in my background as an occupational therapist, is that living life is the ultimate form of fatigue management. So this means that you are maintaining structure in a daily routine, that you are setting realistic goals and you're reflecting on those goals continuously. So you're upgrading them, you're improving them. That in all of that, you know what triggers you specifically, but also what energizes you. So not just stopping yourself from getting really exhausted, but finding a way to fill your bucket back up again. Prioritizing activity to know when and how to use your energy. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of thinking about your day, thinking about how you're feeling about the day. And practicing acceptance and self-compassion. It is incredibly frustrating, I'm sure, when you can't do all the things that you want to do, or when you set up really sometimes rigid schedules about what you should and shouldn't be doing. And so having self-compassion, and accepting new baselines, new normals while working towards goals is a really healthy thing to work towards. Load splitting and pacing yourself. We're not all perfect. We all get tired. And certainly we have to find ways to break down activities in ways that are meaningful to us. And that this issue of avoiding complete inactivity is a really important one, and finding ways to do things and not avoid these, and avoid prolonged durations of rest and inactivity, so that we don't enter that loop of functional deconditioning where now we actually our fatigue is worse, our energy levels are worse off, so even harder to get back to doing things that we want to do. For any of the healthcare providers in the audience, beyond the nurse, if I missed that, my apologies. This is a list of fatigue measures. I'm certainly not familiar with all of them, but I pulled them from the references that I used for this presentation, if it is of interest to you. And here's a list of all the references in case you want to look at some of this research on your own. But I really appreciate your time and thank you for having me.